Whoa, another QE video. Why not? Just because, Maryann made a comment, and, it's always, it's, the subtlety of the language of how you describe what this is, right? Because it's not, it's a loan, okay? The government's borrowed bank digits to buy securities. So it's a loan in the sense that the money in the reserve account, the $3.5 trillion, has bought something, securities, bonds. It owns something with that money. So there's a direct line between those two things. So whoever's name the securities are in, or the bonds are in, is the name of the person who you could say the reserves belong to. In the sense that when the securities are sold, the debt obligation, let's say the debt of the reserves, belongs to. So when the securities are sold, the reserve money goes away, the debt goes away. So there's a direct relationship between the debt and the security, the thing bought. But it doesn't really matter who you say owns it, whether it's the bank's money or the Federal Reserve's money. It just kind of depends on who you say owns the securities now. Because in a sense, you'd have to argue that the banks own them because the banks bought them with electronic digits that were paid for, that are collateralized by reserve digits. So reserve digits have collateralized bank digits. Not that complicated, right? Yeah, no, it's not that complicated. So I don't know why it becomes complicated. So the real game of this, what the implication is this is just a way of, we didn't borrow the money in the traditional sense of borrowed money, where you issue a bond, take in, the money, purchase price of the bond, pay interest, and then have to pay the money back. In that sense, it wasn't a bond issued, but in a sense, because we actually bought something off the market, so it's a reverse, whatever you want to call that, a reverse something or other. But in the end, the same thing is going to happen. It's just going to happen in reverse. Because eventually we're going to have to put the stuff back on the market and get cash for it. So it's really just an instrument to create a fake stimulus in the economy, in the sense that you're creating this illusion of extra debt. So let's say the banks, on an average year, lent out $6 trillion. This $3.5 trillion would be like half the amount of all the lending in 1 year was done by the U.S. government. So the U.S. government basically took out a loan from the banks, an unsecured loan technically, but secured on reserve digits. And that would have a stimulus effect. So you would argue that if banks lent out $3.5 trillion of extra lending, a 60% increase or whatever in lending this year, everybody would say, well, yeah, that's really good for the economy because there's all this new income being produced from all these new loans. It's good for the rich man's economy. So anyway, but see, I didn't even fix the problem by saying the way I said that, because I didn't. We'll get into it. Okay, my understanding is the Fed lends digits to the banks. So right there we're in trouble. The Fed is not lending digits. We borrowed digits. Okay, the Fed borrowed digits, bank digits, and has secured that borrowing with $3.5 trillion in reserve digits. So the collateral for the loan is the $3.5 trillion in the reserve accounts. But the place where the digits were created is bankers' digits. And, yeah, plainly, the banks had created the digits without any money. Okay, they just created digits. No deposit, just a deposit in a reserve account. So the Fed puts money in the reserve account. The bank considers that a banker's deposit, even though it's technically not a real deposit, quite obviously. It's not a deposit in the bank. It's a deposit in the reserve account. But they're technically using it as a deposit in their bank, because technically the reserve account is their bank. So from the banker's point of view, all the federal government did was it deposited, cash into the bank, but it just didn't print the cash. It's kind of sneaky. All right. At 25% to purchase bonds and securities. At 25% to purchase bonds and securities. So the Fed lends digits. So the Fed didn't lend money to the banks and say the banks will now be borrowing money to buy the securities. That wouldn't make any sense. You know what I'm saying? It didn't, you know what I mean? It didn't really lend the money, and certainly not 25%. It's paying interest on the reserve accounts, which is really the borrowed money. The Fed then pays the banks 25% to hold the excess reserves. Well, like I said, the 25%, there's only one 25% being 0.25% being paid, and that's the 0.25% that's being paid to the banks because we borrowed their digits. We didn't deposit cash in their bank, but we told them to buy something. So from their perspective, right, they're out the digits, they're out the cash. They didn't have to get the cash, they made the digits. So essentially it's a loan. So just like a loan does that, when you go to the bank and put cash in the bank creates digits to represent your cash. So we borrowed the money from the bank. Okay, basically these reserves belong to the Fed. Well, again, the securities belong to the Fed. So, you know, they have the Fed's name on them. So the bonds and the securities are owned by the Fed, technically. So the Fed, yes. So basically the reserves belong to the Fed. The reserves are the collateral for the loan to buy the securities. So when we sell the securities, then we can pay back the loan. Not complicated. The banks were acting on the Fed's behalf as the Fed cannot directly purchase from the marketplace. Well, regardless, the point is usually when they do purchase, they make purchases, traditionally in the old days, in cash. They didn't make purchases in reserves that can't be withdrawn. They made purchases in reserves that would be withdrawn. The banks would convert the reserves into cash. The excess reserves, well, they would convert them by replacing the purchase with the reserve money, right? I mean, technically, right? So if your minimum reserves are 60 billion you have to hold in reserve accounts, and the government puts 60 billion in, and you have 120 billion, well, obviously you'll go back to 60 again, so you took the rest out in cash. Whether you loaned it or not, you took it out as cash. All right. All right. Let's see. Reserves belong to the banks were acting on the Fed. Cannot directly purchase. The excess reserves belong to the Fed, not the banks. Well, no, I'd argue the excess reserves are collateral for the loan to purchase the securities. So obviously it's a well-secured loan in the sense that we own the securities, so we can easily pay back the money, theoretically, as long as these securities we bought can be resold at the price we paid for them. But the argument is, of course, we'll never be able to sell them at the price we paid for them. So when we reissue them, we'll take a huge loss, especially the junk bonds we bought. So the junk bonds will never be able to sell those without a very high premium. And the regular U.S. savings bonds we bought, likewise, will not be reissuable into the market without increasing the interest rate. You will not be able to sell the bonds at the interest rate we bought them at. Okay. Should the economy start to pick up speed and truly grow, which, well, it depends on what you're talking about, an economy growing. You mean the stock market growing? You mean the income the rich derive from debt growing? So again, this whole idea of what grows an economy is a really tricky thing. So, you know, if you're gonna count growth based on M1 kind of numbers, well, that's kind of silly, right? Because we just realized that $3.5 trillion of extra digits were manufactured by the Fed without printing the cash to back them up. So they're in reserve accounts, but technically, if there ever was a run in the bank, those digits would have to be liberated. There will then be a market for which the Fed can sell their holdings. Well, again, that's a theoretical market. I say that market won't exist in the first place. You won't be able to sell them for what you paid for them. So the government's going to take a huge loss on that $3.5 trillion loan. It's going to have to pay back some portion of that loan with some sort of either borrowed money or printed money. So to get all that reserve money out of that reserve account, it's going to have to, let's say it resells the junk, but only gets $2.5 trillion. So it's still got it lost $1 trillion on the deal. It's going to have to either issue a bond to cover that trillion, or it's going to have to print $1 trillion in cash, because that money belongs to the banks, not us. We created bank digits with those reserve money. The only way to undo it is to give the banks cash to cover those reserve digits. I mean the bankers' digits. The bankers' digits can only be closed out by bringing cash into the bank. Inflation comes from low interest rates, not expanding the Fed's balance sheet. Inflation comes from low interest rates, not expanding the Fed's balance sheet. It really doesn't matter where the interest rates are technically, in the sense of depending on how the rest of the economy is working, in terms of what the rate is on borrowing. So I guess the argument of how expensive borrowing is all dependent on whether it's borrowing you're going to pay back. Right? I mean, the function of debt is supposed to be that you borrow the money for a short term because you have a long-term gain. Okay, you're going to repay it back, and in the process you have earned money to pay the interest and to pay the principal, and now you own an asset. So when you theoretically bought off a car, let's say, you purchased the car, you used the car for 15 years. This was the traditional way of doing it. And you paid the car off in, say, 7. So you got the second 7 years for free, technically. So you paid rent on the first 3 years or 7 years of ownership, and the next 7 years were free. So obviously people now, though, are completely losing money on every purchase of a car. They are renting cars perpetually, leasing. They never own anything. They never get out and have any period of value enrichment, or whatever you want to call it. And even in the housing market, that sort of happened now. The mortgages are so high that there's so little equity, real equity, that people aren't gaining any equity over time because they're always paying just interest. So it really depends on when you say low interest rates are bad, okay, because they create inflation. Well, they're only bad if it's credit card money, if it's money people don't intend to pay back. I mean, I say credit card money because, yeah, we have this huge credit card debt that seems like it can't be resolved. People won't pay it back. They have to go to work way too many years to pay back their credit card debt. So who's going to do the work? Who's going to work for free to pay it back? Technically free. So, I mean, it really depends on what kind of debt you're creating. And so it's not the interest rates that's the problem. Low interest rates are great if your borrowing is rational. If your borrowing is irrational, in the sense that you don't plan to pay it back, then, well, again, low interest rates are good because you can get away with it, but you're not going to get away with it forever. Yeah, and certainly high interest rates would create a preposterous kind of inflation, in the sense that obviously people who haven't planned on how they're going to pay something back would have no capacity to pay back those loans. So that would be inflationary in the sense of the destruction of these debt assets. Destruction of their value. All right. Should the economy start to pick up and truly grow, there will then be a market for which the Fed can sell their holdings. So again, this notion of the economy speeding up and truly growing, I bet you there is no speeding up and truly growing. Obviously, the whole point of borrowing the money in this manner, taking assets off the market, the whole point of that was to make it appear as if the economy is growing by increasing the value of the stock market. And that's all it does, right? That's all it did, was increase the asset values. So when you increase asset values, you create an artificial prosperity, which is called growth. It's a credit card example. I mean, I could get a credit card and get a $40,000 credit limit, and I could appear really rich. I could live very high. I could live very well. But obviously, I can't do it forever, and I'll never pay it back. So, it's a disaster. Alright. Inflation comes with low interest rates, not expanding Fed's balance sheet. Well, I think I've just explained that. The importance is that banks feel confident in lending to one another through interbank lending system. Well, like I said, I don't think that has anything to do with this. I really don't. I mean, your theory of this lending system thing being the problem, the reason why the banks lost confidence is because they're not exchanging. They're basically exchanging digits for which they have doubt about the credibility of. There's no point in me accepting another bank's bank digits if they are bankrupt, and when I try to convert those digits into cash, they won't convert. So yes, obviously the banks aren't going to lend to each other when there's a clearly reasonable perception that the bank you're dealing with will not be able to pay back the money you gave them. So obviously that's a problem. And the Federal Reserve, in a sense, changed policy in 2008 so that most of that is semi-worry-free, because now they're transferring reserve digits instead of banker digits. So now, obviously, the reserve digits aren't going to evaporate. They're not going to be destroyed by bankruptcy. So you can't get better than a reserve digit in terms of the fact that it's real money. It's as close to real cash as you can get as a reserve digit, is theoretically the point there. That was a problem back in 2008. Banks stopped lending to each other. The system came to a halt. Well, the problem in 2008 was clearly the fact that it was realized that the banks were all insolvent. So it's, to sit there and say that it was a problem in the transferring system or the interbank loans. What's the point of loaning money to somebody who's bankrupt? I mean, it's kind of silly to say it's a problem without acknowledging what the underlying problem was, which was the banks were bankrupt. That's why they couldn't lend to each other, is because they couldn't trust that the other bank wasn't bankrupt. I mean, come on, blame the right thing. Alright, so this guy just says, I'm just a college dropout from Texas, but what it's worth, I think your opinion is good as any. Well, that's okay. I'm a college dropout, here's my, I like you. Yeah, well, that's cool, but yeah, you shouldn't preface a remark with, I'm an idiot, now here's my opinion. Yeah, that's sort of a, it's just, hey, I'll take whatever compliments I get, but yeah, you shouldn't. Contextualizing your comment by destroying your own credibility probably isn't a great idea. Anyway, so here we go, Mariana again. I've bothered you enough with this QE thing. I don't understand this bothered me enough. I mean, there hasn't really been a problem in our conversation on this subject, beyond the fact that I don't agree with you about everything. But I think we both understand, that they didn't do this for no reason, right? That it is a move that has every appearance of being kind of desperate, because I think we could both agree that there's no obvious prospect that the economy is anytime soon going to be in any condition for which you want to put $3.5 trillion of new assets on the market. I think we could both understand that. And so that the solution, this was a short-term, this was all synthetic sugar. There was no value, there's no good calories in this QE thing. Okay, these are all garbage calories, and that the health consequences, the long-term health consequences of doing this are not good. That this is not a good thing to do. Maybe you don't believe that, but that this will have no long-term. This is one of those desperate things, like when governors sell the lottery or something. You know, or they borrow on 10 years of cigarette taxes to pay current expenses. This is not a smart move. So here is a way to make it simple, yet drive you crazy at the same time. Double entry bookkeeping. Well, like I said, I mean, double entry bookkeeping doesn't even have a really good definition anyway, does it? And some of that, you know, it all depends on conspiracy theory notions, right? I mean, I could call it double entry bookkeeping to recognize that when I'm a bank and I hold a mortgage for the full value of a house, you know, that I've basically way over collateralized a loan, and that I might as well use that money for other purposes because it's in excess of necessary collateral. So you could say that's double entry, but in a sense it's just recognizing I hold the asset value, and there's no point in denying the existence of that asset value. I mean, technically over the last 80 years the value of a house has been more reliable than the value of a dollar. So in a sense, you know, houses have been more reliable money than money. So why wouldn't you count the asset value of a house? You know, so, I mean, but some people might say that's double entry bookkeeping, you know, so, I mean, the definition is too vague. So yeah, that's not going to do me any good. That's not of much use, so screw that. So anyway, this guy just bragged about how obviously fractional reserve banking is not the problem, and that if we had full reserve banking, it would only make us more desperate to borrow. The borrowers would be more desperate. They would pay the rich more and more interest. The rich would get even richer because they'd be able to secure higher and higher interest rates based on the limited amount of cash available for borrowing, and that would make it really hard for poor people to start businesses or do any of that kind of stuff. So yeah, it would kind of make the monopolies even stronger, and the entrenched money even stronger. So the old money would be even more powerful. So anyway, but you know, there's no denying the truth that all of this depends on whether we're talking about loans people intend to pay back versus loans people don't intend to pay back. It seems quite obvious that the federal government has taken out loans it does not intend to pay back. It has never paid them back except for a tiny period during Clinton that was just an accident of the prosperity of the mega rich. I mean, the richest 1% got richer, so revenues increased and they actually paid the bill for a year. But outside of that year, we have never paid back debt. So clearly we never intend to pay off this credit card. It is a liability we intend to pay rent on forever. And my argument is that psychology ensures the failure of the economy. Because the rent makes it guarantees the rich get richer. It guarantees people it guarantees profit on surplus. And guarantees of profit on surplus guarantee that workers have to pay it. And so you have to take the value out of the workers' welfare to pay that profit. And as that profit keeps growing, that means their assets keep growing. So if you pay surplus profit, surplus grows and then demands more profit, and then grows and then demands more profit, and grows and demands more profit. You see how that's just totally unsustainable. So as a monster in the economy, it will consume the entire economy eventually. Obviously it can't get to that point, but all it has to get to is this point where it becomes too big a piece of the economy, is paying salaries to surplus, not paying salaries to workers for productivity, paying salaries to surplus for just being surplus. And that's death. The welfare wealthy are taking too much value out of the economy. It's just a fact. The rich are too rich. T-O-O. And it's unsustainable. Their appetite is too large, and they are too unproductive. So, till next time.